Today we're talking about crowd control reduction items, and in that context we also have to talk about diminishing returns. Crowd control reduction is quite obvious. It is reducing crowd control effects on you, whereas diminishing returns is what happens if you get hit by multiple crowd control reduction effects after each other. Diminishing returns makes sure that you don't get stun locked for too long, for example, as that's just not a fun mechanic to play against. As such, if you get stunned once, then the next stun afterwards will have a shorter duration. More specifically, the second stun would have a duration of 2/3 of the original time, meaning a 3-second stun would be turned into a 2-second stun, and the third stun would have a third of the duration, meaning a 3-second stun would turn into a 1-second stun. Before we get into the rest of the info, it's good to know a little bit more about diminishing returns. This information is taken from Flareboots' Word of Thoth, link will be down below, and it's as follows. It should be noted that although knock-up and knockback, banish, pulls, grabs, and carries, as well as polymorph and permafrost apply a stack of diminishing returns, they will not be impacted by it. Grabs and carries include abilities such as Capri's Abduct, Fenrir's Ragnarok, his ultimate, and the first section of Tyr's Fearless Assault. Pushed include Kuzenbo's Sumo Slam. Generally speaking, there's a very easy way to determine if something will be affected by diminishing returns or not in most cases, and that is the enemy actively in the act of crowd controlling you? If an enemy pushes you around or holds you down and is unable to use abilities at the same time themselves, that's a clear indication that crowd control will not affect the crowd control ability, because otherwise the opponent would still perform this move while you're no longer under the effect of crowd control. Whereas abilities that just have an initial crowd control and allow the enemy to use other abilities afterwards will be affected by crowd control reduction. That means that, for example, in the case of Ares' ultimate, the pull, you would not get a reduced duration of the pull itself, but the stun that follows, because the pull itself is something where Ares is in the active act of pulling you and he will not be able to do things himself, but when you're stunned afterwards, he can do things himself. Crowd control can not be reduced under 0.5 seconds, neither through diminishing returns, nor Tyr's passives, nor crowd control reduction. There are 4 factors going into crowd control, and they're applied in this order. First, the initial crowd control duration, so the normal time for the crowd control. Then the unyielding passive from Tyr, if applicable, so that only applies for Tyr. Then afterwards, the crowd control reduction, meaning that if you have crowd control reduction, it will further reduce crowd control on Tyr below 1 second. And last but not least, the crowd control diminishing returns. This order means that if you have crowd control reduction in a high CC comp, or rather against a high CC comp, you'll be able to reduce your crowd control time quite drastically, very quickly, due to the fact that the diminishing returns is applied afterwards to the already reduced time. Diminishing returns on a character lasts for 15 seconds, and if another form of crowd control is applied, it restacks. As such, during a teamfight, it's very realistic that you will be able to keep up the crowd control reduction, and in the case of playing versus a Xbalanque, it can potentially be useful to intentionally get stunned by his ultimate and reduce further CC afterwards if you're about to go into a fight. Now for crowd control reduction itself. The cap for this is 40%, though that can never be reached in one item. There are a lot of items that have 20% crowd control reduction. Reinforced Greaves or Shoes, Bulwark of Hope, Ethereal Staff, Oni Hunter's Garb, Shogun's Kasari, Spectral Armor, Spirit Robe, and Winged Blade. There's one item, as far as I could find out, that has 10% crowd control reduction, which is Gem of Isolation. And then there is Ares, who has a built-in crowd control reduction of up to 30 in his 2, and I think he is the only god. I may be wrong here, I didn't look through all the gods and there's no resource for this. But if there are other gods, there's definitely not too many of them, with the exception of Tyr, obviously, who has his own passive in that regard. And that should already strike you as odd. Usually when it comes to any sort of effects on gods, I'm relatively well informed, and there is some sort of resource if I don't know what's going on with that particular thing. In the case of crowd control reduction, there isn't. And that might be for a good reason, or maybe not. Fact is, as it stands, crowd control reduction is one of the most overlooked stats in Smite. Hardly anyone takes notice of it. And that's not surprising, because if you look in the items tab in the store, then you won't even find the effect crowd control reduction. You'll find cooldown reduction, but as crowd control reduction was introduced into the game later, There is no own tab for it and it's never been added. As such, actively implementing those items into your build already requires you to know which items actually have the effect, and often it's an ignored additional bonus stat that you're kind of like, yeah, I'll take that stat, but I won't build an item specifically for it. The only items that at least to some degree have been built for it at some point were reinforced shoes and grease, and maybe only Hunter's Garb. Why is crowd control reduction so neglected? Well, first of all, there are so many sources where it doesn't apply. Like I said, if something is channeled in some way, then it won't apply no matter what the effect is. It won't work against a Nox 1, it won't work against a Hunbat's ult. It won't work against a Fenrir ult, an Ares ult only to some degree, against a Xingtian ult, and a Willish ult, or even a Hades ult. The reason in Hunbat's case is a little bit different, by the way, it's because it refreshes and ticks, but all of these come down to the same issue. If you're building specifically to counter crowd control, then you would think that it will affect most crowd control, and it's not exactly most when there are so many effects that can somehow slip past it. Quite often, when you want to counter hard crowd control, it feels more reliable to invest into Magi's Blessing and just counter it entirely, or to invest into Spirit Robe for the damage reduction rather than the crowd control reduction on the item, and that's just a little bonus. Another problem are the items that are tied to the effect. You have Bulwark of Hope, which is only really a super tanky defense item, but doesn't come with many benefits for your team, so the only ones who probably build it most of the time are solos, and even there you will often have to build Pestilence or something in its place. Ethereal is kind of a niche item anyways. Only Hunter's Garb used to be higher valued by the pros, but overall is still a bit of an awkward item. Shogun's Kusari has a nice aura, but it doesn't really offer the protections as other support items do at least, so if anything you see it more often solo as well, and even most solo laners think that the protection values on the item are too low. Spectral Armor, again, is something that you build for a completely different purpose right now, and the crowd control reduction just feels misplaced because it doesn't bring anything in the context of crit. It's something entirely unrelated at this point. Spirit Robe, again, I think is one of the few items where it really makes sense and that can be built reliably in many builds, no matter which role you are in. Winged Blade is something you build more to counter slows. At that point, you're usually not too concerned with other forms of CDR and you just want to specifically counter the slows. And when you immune the slow, it doesn't really matter if you have CCR afterwards anymore. It doesn't really have an impact on the effect. The CCR on Gem of Isolation is relatively low and hardly noticeable unless you build more CCR combined with it. So as you can see, many of the items that provide CCR are kind of outlier items that don't really have much relevance for most roles, for most guards, and therefore just rarely see play in the first place. There are also some interesting effects regarding slows. It does work on slows, but for example on Nemesis Ultimate it will split the ult and the slow from each other, and the ult lasts longer than the slow, which makes sense. The protection reduction should be independent of the slow. But on Horrific Emblem it seems that both effects are tied, at least from what the indicator shows us. So in total, we are kind of left with a lack of consistency when it comes to crowd control reduction. Too many guards that are just outlier cases and will not proc the effects, and too many things that are unclear in regards to how it works. There's also no simple way to specifically look for crowd control reduction when buying items, which will especially throw newer players off that have never even heard of the effect before or don't know that it exists in that form in Smite. Unless you're specifically looking for items that do it and then maybe write them down or something, you'll always be stuck searching for them. And that's a super annoying start if you want to have a stat be as present as others. And then on top of all that, it's also mostly on items that aren't the most useful ones in many situations and can't be bought by everyone, at least not in Conquest. I think if people were a little more aware, especially of the interaction with crowd control reduction and diminishing returns and how that can be beneficial, then some more people might be investing into these items in more situations. But overall, I think they still remain niche cases. I think CCR is in itself a very strong stat that shouldn't be underrated. But often enough, the guards that can go into it are also more of the frontliners. The frontliners aren't exactly the ones that get CC'd the most. And they're also not the ones that would be impacted most by crowd control reduction. CC is often used to interrupt an ability. That will still happen with reduction regardless. And at the same time, you're going to try and focus out the squishies with your CC, because you can often blow up a squishy within a single crowd control. A tank, when crowd control, usually doesn't care that much because usually they're able to survive it, and often enough they won't get that much damage invested onto them rather than looking for the backline instead. I think it would be interesting to either see some more aura-oriented items with crowd control reduction, or maybe even aggressive item choices, so that more guards can consider this choice. Kinda in the way as Gem of Isolation implements it, but maybe a little more than 10%. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to hit the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. And see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.